Hi folks, it's JP. I was having some thoughts about this design topic, about like a level design topic recently, and I realized that I actually didn't necessarily trust just my own limited perspective on it. So I wanted to just make a video and talk about it and open it up to y'all and just see what y'all think about this. So the point that I'm making here, I've opened up Unreal. This is a level called the Sunspire in Unreal, and if you watched my tourism playthrough of it from a few years back, then you'll recognize it. I'm actually I've opened this up mainly in tourism mode, mainly just so that I can use it as a visual aid while I think through this thing. But, so yeah, this is a level that happens about midway through Unreal, the very first Unreal, which came out almost exactly 20 years ago. And like many levels in Unreal, it's very big. You start in this outdoor area, and you've come from a little bit more of a linear section here. And then this is still linear, but you're moving along these paths and stuff. And let me just go ahead and, yeah, we've got our hilarious little fast motion walk here so that I can cover enough ground. So you're walking in this level, and you're in this big open outdoor area. You look down, and a long, long way down, there's some lava and stuff that you will definitely die if you fall into. And then you see the entrance across a long, narrow bridge, and there we go, I just died. Let's load this back up here. And actually, yeah, let me just go into God mode here. Oh yeah, okay. Alright, so let me get back there. And like I said, I mainly just wanted to use this as a visual aid because it's, as a level, it sort of exemplifies this idea that I wanted to talk about, which is that I was thinking about the significance of load screens in games. You know, whenever you're playing through a game, like a single-player game that has a world that's divided into levels, it's not just a big open world game where everything streams in constantly. I think that's a whole different can of worms as far as just, you know, how the player thinks about space and models it. But yeah, you have these discrete chunks of gameplay that have been built in their own little bubbles and stuff, and maybe they're strung together contiguously, you know, in the case of Unreal or Half-Life or something, or maybe they're not, like say Thief 1 and 2's mission-based design. But in this case, yeah, we've got like this big level, and we've got an outdoor space, a very large outdoor space, and then we walk into an indoor space. And then we go into a whole bunch of stuff. Like I'm going to skip past all of this stuff. I'm really only going to just run around a little bit inside here so you can get a sense for just how big this place is. You know, there's multiple rooms and corridors, and like, you know, we went through a big vertical chamber there, and then there's another big vertical chamber that goes way, way up. And then there's a few things that will take us outside of that. Hold on, let me jump outside here. Let me fly out. Yeah, so I'm using a cheat code here to fly through solid collision, through solid world geometry here. And yeah, there's all kinds of rooms and stuff. And when you're inside of this, it actually feels very much like you're in just an older style, like Quake type map or something. You know, this especially feels Quake 1-ish. But then, you know, there's a few situations here. Let me speed up. I'm using the console here to speed myself up because actually covering these distances, these very large distances, takes some real time. There's various points where you pop out here. And then, you know, you can like see into this structure, but then when you're outside, you come out and you're like, oh yeah, I still sure am in that big space. And you look down and you see this really, you know, you see the lava all the way down there, and if you jump off, you will actually fall that entire distance that you climbed steadily through going through those elevators and stuff like that. And then you go in and you know, there's more lifts and stuff, and you ride those up. Whoop. Yeah, I'm in fast motion here, so it's going to be a little goofy. Yeah, maybe I can ride this up. Woohoo! Okay. And then eventually you come out, and I think this is where... Let's see, where are we going here? Okay, no, actually, I'm turned around. However, yeah, so we fly up, and I'll spoil this level for you a little bit. Eventually, you wind up on the very top of this giant space. You know, you come in, and then boom, and it's like, oh, cool, I can see the sky now. And you are now very, very high up in that exact same spot. And so significantly here, there were no loads or anything. You know, the way that you would have had to do this in an older engine made for less powerful hardware or whatever, is that you would divide this into chunks, right? There's actually very little reason, given that you can't, if you jump off of here and you fall all the way down there, you'll just die. There's actually very little reason for all of this, and yeah, see, now that I've flown into the spire itself, you can see that all of these rooms have been just carved out of this giant solid piece that is in itself sitting in a giant outdoor area. So I remember looking at this thing way back in the day and just understanding like how they built these, trying to learn how they built these spaces. And this was like really impressive, you know. I mean, the scale of this is impressive, and then just the fact that they built like this very significant. I mean, inside of the Sunspire itself, there's an entire Quake 1 map's worth of space in here, say. But the fact that it intersects with this big outdoor area, it made an impression on me, you know. And this sort of became this and levels like it, of which there are not too many, especially from this era when, you know, having gigantic levels was kind of hard. It's sort of like, you know, I think I absorbed it unconsciously back in the day. And then later, as I, you know, had a little bit more self-awareness about how I thought about making levels and how I thought about, you know, as I'm playing through games, you know, I sort of began to think about this in a more self-conscious way. Yeah, because I think so here's maybe my thesis. I think anytime a person is playing a video game, and it's a video game with 3D space, I think that every player has some sort of modeling process going on where they are mapping out the spaces that they've been to. And I think that they think in terms of spaces that they could get to and can't get to. And what I think is that even players who don't know anything about level design and who don't pay very close attention to like when there's a level load and when they have changed levels, you know, moved from one virtual space full of its own smoke and mirrors into another virtual space, I think my argument is that they still absorb this on a subconscious level. You know, they understand sort of the parameters, the spatial and technical parameters that these spaces exist under, and that therefore it's meaningful when a player who is not a professional game developer or a level designer or whatever, or even like a particularly savvy gamer. I don't think people necessarily. I think people do on some level understand when they are in a space that is contiguous, like this is, or versus when it's not contiguous. So as a couple of other examples that are maybe useful, and I can't necessarily launch these games, or even if I did launch them, it wouldn't necessarily be like this awesome, you know, clear example of it like I have in the form of this level from Unreal. But in Half-Life 1, you know, Half-Life 1's world, it's the Black Mesa Research Facility, and it is much more, compared to Unreal even, which is still a relatively linear first-person shooter from 1998. Compared to Unreal, Half-Life 1 is much more tunnely, you know. It's linear, and you're frequently underground, so you're moving through these very tightly constrained spaces. It'll open up sometimes, and you'll get a little bit more of you'll get an outdoor area, or just a larger indoor chamber or something. But you're always kind of going through this mazy type stuff. And the interesting thing, the reason that I thought of it as I was constructing this statement here, was that in Half-Life 1, the levels are divided into very small chunks compared to Unreal 1, and so the level loads, the amount of time that it takes, first of all, between level loads is very small. Like, even I remember back in the day playing it on a much less powerful PC, the level loads were only like a second or so at most, you know, and I think they designed it that way. You know, that was something where they saw the value in having very low level load times and dividing things up into little chunks, because that makes it easier to think about and track and revise. You know, there's fewer files for different designers on the team to be editing. But I think it does that whole, you know, so on the one hand, Half-Life 1 is presenting a completely spatially contiguous journey, more or less, from the very beginning of the game when you're on that train and you're riding through, all the way deep into the guts of this weird Black Mesa facility sort of place. But so I think level loads do have a different role there. Like you're intended to pass through them, and I think they kind of wanted to hide them as much as possible. They were like, level loads need to exist for various technical reasons, but we want to hide them and make them as transparent as possible. And in an ideal world, the load would still be there, but it would happen so instantaneously that you wouldn't even notice, And they actually did work, like, the programmers and stuff did work on that project to make, within a load zone on one of those little boundary zones between maps, like if a monster is on the other side of a level load, it'll load in, and then it will actually be there, even though it technically came from another level. It sort of traveled with you, and I think that's so that's that they were saying level loads exist, but let's make them as transparent as possible. On the third example that I can think of here. Are the Elder Scrolls games, and unfortunately I don't have I can't easily launch into like Fallout 3 or Oblivion or whatever. But if you're familiar with those games, then this will be a familiar situation. In those games, you have a giant open world that is divided up into that actually functions much like a modern open world game, where the world is divided up into chunks of landscape that stretch on in every direction for miles and miles. But in the case of the Elder Scrolls game specifically, not every open world game does this, but in the case of the Elder Scrolls and then like also the Bethesda Fallout games, I guess, when you enter pretty much any interior, there's a load screen. There's a load, and what you're loading into is actually it's just the interior of that building. It's a tiny little space. That really is just like this little capsule apart from the rest of the world. On some level, I'm guessing that the game is still simulating what's outside in the world, like if NPCs are going about their little routines and all the other stuff that happens in that game. It's still ticking those things along, or it's like hanging on to them so that it can figure out where they need to be later to simulate the passage of time. But when you go into an interior in a Bethesda game, you are very much loading into a pocket world where the interactive and spatial dimensions of the world shrink down considerably, and you're really only thinking about that one space. Now, personally, and this I think is more a matter of taste, and it's something where I can very clearly acknowledge my own bias, I personally think that this leaves a lot of money on the table as far as level design opportunities, because it means that the interiors, as they have them, as they exist, they tend to be very static, and their interrelationships with the outside world tend to be pretty straightforward and static, whereas in a game that has a lot more interesting, complicated indoor-outdoor interplay, there's just a lot more interesting things that happen, in my opinion. Like being able to, like the classic case that I've brought up multiple times is you go into it, you find an inn, you're wandering across the landscape, and you come to a little village, and there's an inn in the village, and you go into that inn, and you're inside, and you see a full interior, and there's a bar and whatever, and then there's some stairs up there that go up to the rooms, because that's the classic Dungeons and Dragons fantasy inn setup, and there's some rooms upstairs where you can stay for the night. Classic RPG stuff. In a Bethesda game, you go into one of those inns, and each of those little rooms really are just like islands within an island. You come off of that hallway and you go into that room, and there probably is some sort of like opaque window mesh in that room that is suggesting that, like, yeah, you're upstairs and there's a window to the outside, but you cannot see out into that, as far as I know. I mean, I don't know. I haven't played Fallout 4 at all, and I've played Skyrim only a little bit. So if they did fix this, then let me know, because maybe I'm just, shooting in the dark here. But the impression that I got from playing all those other the games before then, was that, yeah, like that window that you see, you kind of know that thing is just fake, and so there are certain things that, and so that's, I don't want to dwell too much on the technical ramifications of that, because I think there's a certain like line of technical gamer critique that's like, oh, well, yeah, it's not as cool because, they're having to do all this stuff. And it's like, I want to disentangle the technical and like maybe production value arguments from just the design arguments of like, what is this space trying to be? What kind of experience is it providing? Whatever. Because I think that when you have the opportunity as a level designer, having built a lot of spaces myself, when you have the opportunity as a level designer to be like, you know what, I'm going to give this one room a balcony. I'm gonna check outside. I'm gonna look outside of this inn, And we're up on the second story here, and actually, yeah, this would be a cool place to have a balcony because there's actually a rooftop of the next little thing over, and maybe the player could use that to sneak into a house through a second story or an attic or something at night, you know, which is something that you do in those games. You sneak into houses at night if you're a thiefy person. And that's just one example of like the indoor-outdoor of complex indoor-outdoor interplay that is typically implemented by level designers opportunistically. You know, like you'll build out a space according to a plan, and sometimes you'll just see something where you're like, oh yeah, actually, if I just created a little doorway here, or knocked a hole in this wall, knocked this wall out, or created a window here even, I would create some new opportunity for player observation or experience, you know, where you're like, oh, I can see out this window that there's actually like a rooftop, that there's a rooftop entrance into that whole other building. And as it stands in Bethesda games, you don't have those opportunities because those windows are always opaque, because indeed the entire rest of the world is not fully loaded in, and it's definitely not rendering. And so I've thought about this for many years. Like, I don't know, a long time ago, Robert Yang made like a blog post where he was thinking about some level design topic, and this topic came up, and I sort of made my case, and he made a case that it doesn't actually matter that much. And I was like, yeah, that's actually pretty reasonable, and probably like this might just be. So my question for y'all, as we're staring at this example of something that I think is relatively rare and unique among, you know, level design, is like, you as people watching this video, as other developers, or just as people who play games, I value both of those classes of opinion, honestly, and I especially value non-dev opinions here, because y'all are just playing video games and playing them to think about them and enjoy them maybe, and not relentlessly deconstructing them the way that I am. But I think there is something special about like a lack of load boundaries and a lack of, you know, technical and functional separation between interior and exterior space, and even just disparate spaces within the world, you know, even just abstracting beyond interior exterior. And I think that stuff, I maintain that stuff does have a cognitive impact on players, even when they don't realize. That's why I say cognitive, because it's sort of like all those different ways of sinking in, like what a space is and like how you perceive it and how you mentally model it, you know. So that's a question for y'all, honestly, and I would be curious to hear from you in the comments, or if you're responding on Twitter or something, or just whatever. Yeah, do you think about level loads that much? I know that another factor that I know is significant in this discussion is that modern open world games, you know, have largely done away with loads. You know, they've just made like, you know, the entire world can stream in, and it's running on a powerful system with tons of memory, and you can just wander for days. I will say that in a lot of those games, the amount of interior space doesn't end up being as significant as it is in, say, a game that's more interior focused, like these late 90s FPSs and stuff, even though the detail counts and whatever aren't nearly as significant. A lot of times open world games, like, it's like the dominant mode of building as developers, and then of consuming the space as players. I think, you know, it does tend to be outdoor focused, so you think in terms of square footage, and so an interior really only exists as a function of that square footage, you know. And I think that's a paradigm for thinking about space that is somewhat unique to open world games. So I acknowledge that you know, ever since open world games started becoming a thing, you know, starting with, you know, like GTA 3, let's say, as an early significant entry, I think, you know, that has radically shaped how people think of stuff. And maybe one effect, maybe, you know, if you're younger than I am, and you've never known a video games medium that has not had open world games, maybe level loads are totally invisible to you, you know, or maybe you really notice them because they feel super significant because you're not used to them, because you've played a lot more games. You've played Assassin's Creed and Minecraft and whatever, and those games just don't, you know, those are all about the streaming world. But yeah, so I don't know. That's just that's some food for thought. I hope this visual aid has been at all useful. Yeah, I still think about this level sometimes, even though it's not what I would call like a perfect. It's not like. There are other things about this level that I don't necessarily like, but I've always found the scale of it and the indoor-outdoor interplay, and even its indoor-outdoor interplay. Like even there, I have some critiques because I feel like its indoor-outdoor interplay is actually pretty simplistic, and maybe that was for technical reasons or whatever. But it's a big, fat, like obvious example of this thing that I'm talking about, so that's why I opened it up. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on that or something that I'm missing, or one conclusion, one thing that if you tell it to me, I'm probably just going to nod along and be like, yeah, no, I totally buy it. Is if you say, JP, actually, you're thinking too much like a game developer here. These things that are really just implementation details, load screens, and these indoor-outdoor separations. Those are really just implementation details, and normal players don't think about them very much. If you tell the player that they're going outside, even if there is a little bit of a loading prompt or something, people don't notice it. They just take it as a given. I I can't discount that perspective because you're somebody who does not think about the artifact of the game as a produced thing that people made in a level editor or something, and I think that's valuable. On the other hand, yeah, I think maybe it's like, yeah, because some games still, they go really heavy with the load screens. I think that's something that, even though technologically you have the ability to string a lot of gigabytes of content together now, a lot of games just still do approach it as like, no, there's a load screen here and that's fine, just deal with it, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts on those kinds of experiences as well. Does that change the way that you think about the space? Does it change the way that you think about what's possible? Does it change the way that you experience immersion? I know that that's a loaded word with a lot of baggage unto itself, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm very curious to hear other people's perspectives on it, because I've kind of stated my case here. But yeah, I think that's about all I've got. Thank you for watching this video, and yeah, let me know what you think. And yeah, maybe, I don't know, if other topics like this pick at my brain in the future, then maybe I'll make other videos like this in the future. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.